I have to acknowledge my co-author, Madi Sarsambaya, who was at the Peterson Institute for a few years and is now the IMF. But I'm hoping he will continue working with me on this paper. So I will try to do a slightly accelerated version of the paper to give us more time for questions, but feel free to ask questions along the way. Well, let me go back. Everyone, 3 years ago, COVID hit and caused a lot of disruption and caused a lot of changes. And in my view, and especially in the US, unleashed a massive fiscal expansion that we have never seen in peacetime. I am not going to talk about that today. I would say that for any questions you have about that, let's postpone until the end if we have time. My paper is entirely about the 25 years before COVID. I believe, and you may disagree, but I believe that we are gradually moving back towards that world, and that these lessons that we had then will become relevant again. I think COVID is very unique. I think the fiscal response was unique, certainly in the US. There's no pressure for continued stimulus package and stimulus checks anymore. I think it was viewed as a one-time thing, and highly inflationary, obviously. I can take credit because 2 years ago, I was one of those people, Larry Summers, maybe you both, I don't know, but certainly Olivia Blanchard, who were writing that this massive fiscal program in the US was going to be inflationary. It was textbook macroeconomics. And why was the Federal Reserve not seeing this? So the Fed made a big mistake, but so did many other private forecasters. And I still cannot understand why the macro profession in the United States didn't see this coming. It is a puzzle to me. But this is all not on the topic today, please. My paper is before that. We made a big mistake, fine. Let's not design monetary policy to suit a once in a 100-year phenomenon. Let's look at what was going on for the 25 to 30 years before that, because that was more, I believe, that. Sorry, that's a preamble. The bottom line I have today is that I have become convinced that for 25 years at least, and in some cases more, like in Japan, central banks in all the advanced economies allowed unemployment to be higher than it needed to be. They could have done almost as well on their inflation objectives. And in fact, in some ways better, because to the extent that they were below their inflation objectives, they would have been better. But even if they were a little bit above, they wouldn't have been much worse off. And still they could have had much more unemployment. So there was a trade-off here that was well worth taking, in my view, that we didn't take. And I believe it happened because the way we modeled the world was just wrong. All the major macro models are linear, and they don't actually allow for important non-linearity that I want to talk about. And that I think Volker and I both have done DSGE type modeling, and I used to hate nonlinear models because, they're so hard to work with, and you can get any result you want if you have a strange enough. But in this case, I think it matters. I'm forced to concede that maybe this is one case. So one point of my paper could be taken as central banks should raise their inflation target. I don't want to stress that too much, but it would help, in my view. The other lesson, however, is even if they keep the same targets, they could have done better by doing some experimentation, by actually probing to see, could we push unemployment lower? Could we get the economy running stronger without losing our inflation objective? I think they would have found that that was true. I'm going to show you, in fact, for the US, that this is what Jay Powell, in fact, said, and I think he was right. So they could have gone faster. And this is what led me to contact Volker in Farsight, because Volker has a paper that says exactly that back in 2003. So, and I liked it very much, and so it's cited in the paper. Although I wonder if you still agree with that. Anyway, it always depends. Yeah, you'll see as you go through, but you can abuse it, obviously. The paper highlights the importance of a dual mandate. You could put price stability as the preeminent mandate, the top mandate, fine. But it's nice to have a secondary mandate that says, without the jeopardizing of the first mandate, you should aim for maximum growth and maximum employment, which is what the Fed has equal mandates. The Fed has maximum employment and price stability are equal. But even if you put price stability above it, it's still good to have a secondary objective in this. So that's the conclusion. So you know where we're headed. So then let's talk about that nonlinearity. So I read Keynes finally a couple of years ago, and he says this in beautiful language, but he has no equations and no diagrams. It's hard to figure out what he's talking about, but he has this sentence which I think captures what he thought was important in the Great Depression, that workers would resist taking any nominal wage cuts, even in the Depression. But that if there was more demand at a given wage, they would flood in and they would supply more labor. And so you could get more output for a while without causing inflation. But if you had less output, you wouldn't get deflated because people would resist. So you get stuck in this trap. And that gives rise to nonlinearity, which Phillips, the famous Phillips of the Phillips curve, Alvin Phillips, who was a student of Keynes, I think he had the insight to see, well, this implies a relationship that we could look at. And what he showed that very high rates of unemployment in the gold standard in the UK had very little downward effect on wages. And so if you see wages being stable over time, it doesn't mean it's not sufficient to say that you're at full employment. You might be above full employment. You don't, it's not a sufficient statistic. We often, central banks think if inflation's stable, we've done our job, we can stop now. But the point here is no, you could have stable inflation and not be doing the best. This was the original Phillips curve, which he drew, which is about as nonlinear as a relationship can be and still be sensible. And I don't insist that unemployment is the be-all and end-all measure. There are other measures of labor slack, where we could think of other measures of aggregate supply, controlling for various factors. The key point is that however you think of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, the adjustment process of inflation that adjusts to the deviations of those curves is a nonlinear process in this particular way. That it's easier to get more inflation when you're running the economy hot. It's hard to get deflation when you're in a recession. So that's the nonlinearity. Now I need a small digression because you might say, well, wait a minute, what about inflation expectations? Aren't they important for the Phillips curve? And of course they are. In the gold standard, when Phillips was doing this, people had a long run mindset of near zero, very low inflation. And so that's how you could get a Phillips curve in the raw data. But as we went to the breakdown of Bretton Woods and the rise of inflation in the 60s and 70s, those expectations became what we call acceleration, that is, they're unanchored, that people, whatever inflation has been lately is what they expect it to be. And it's particularly the longer term measures that matter. And those were rising in the 60s and 70s, especially in the US, more in the US than Germany, but even in the US. And there are also some demographic and institutional changes to the labor market, especially in Europe, that caused the natural rate of unemployment to move, and that also is something you have to control for. And so you can no longer see the Phillips curve from mid-60s to the mid-90s, basically for 30 years. But it turns out, and I'll show you, you're beginning to get a return of the Phillips curve in raw data, at least in some countries, it's becoming apparent. And I'll show you a few examples. But so I'm going to always assume that inflation expectations remain anchored because central banks are pretty much maintaining price stability as a key objective. I don't know. So we're not going back to the 70s and 80s. In the 70s and 80s, however, if you control for supply shocks and inflation expectations, the linear Phillips curve worked pretty well. People did look for nonlinearities, but they weren't strongly significant. You didn't necessarily, it wasn't strong evidence for that. However, the transition to ultra-low inflation has led many researchers who look into Phillips curves find a lower Phillips curve. So this is the widespread finding. As we go into 2000s, Phillips curve slope is lower. You should see that it's lower. In my view, and this is the key point of the paper, I believe I can explain what all these papers who out there show that the Phillips curve slope is flatter. I believe it's a result of two phenomena. First is a downward wage and price review. As we get inflation closer to zero, it gets harder and harder to get lower than that. So the Phillips curve gets bent near zero. And it's actually, it doesn't have to be literally zero, because if you think about wages, a 2% wage increase on average means some people are getting 5 and some people are getting -1, and the average is 2. Well, those people who are getting -1 really resist that, and some of them would rather be unemployed. And so that pushes up unemployment. And so you don't have to get inflation all the way to zero for the zero bound to matter, because of the microeconomics of individual people who have different experiences in the labor market. Again, the overall inflation rates have averaged many different individual inflation rates, and those that resist hitting zero, that truncate, that squishes the distribution, and it pushes, it bends the Phillips curve. There's a number of papers that look at this. There's a lot of empirical evidence showing that that this truncation is important, and there's a lot of theory papers on how this works. I'm not a theorist, so I just pointed to them. But once you have this bent curve like what Phillips saw, if you combine that with most of the observations being on the flat part, the right part, the high unemployment part, then empirically you're just going to estimate a flat Phillips curve if you just think about the Phillips equation here. If you force an estimation of a linear line here, it's going to be pretty flat, and you're not going to get that steep part. So you need to have more observations down here to see that steepness, and we just don't have any. My point is that we've been in this region all across the advanced economies almost continuously for 25 years, and so we only see a flat Phillips curve. And then COVID shifted the labor market in a way that pushed us into that part of the curve, but I would postpone discussions. That's a different thing. So I did work that looks at the US Phillips curve, but also we looked in for many countries. This is what we found. We go back to the 50s, and we allow the curve to be different in high and low inflation. So in high inflation, we allow it to be a different slope than low inflation. What we found is that high inflation is pretty steep, but in low inflation, it seems like a kink works well. So it's sort of flat when unemployment is high, but it's pretty steep and low. The problem is there aren't a lot of observations in these regions, so statistically, it's not clear whether it just gets flat everywhere or there is a steep part. The data slightly confirm this, but actually not. We couldn't project that it's still flat, but flat from here. But it suddenly fits the data a bit better, and it makes some sense, because the reason it kinks is because of the low inflation. And so that shouldn't matter so much. That's why you can't get any lower, but you can get higher. You know, if you run the economy hot, you can get more inflation, as we've recently seen. So I think that the left curve makes more sense, fits the data slightly better, and it is observed not in the US only, but also the second paper, we look at 36 countries around the world. and also find it. No?
But maybe once it's quicker, I mean, it could also be like something to look at X-shaped curves, right? So like you could do that, or we also did that at some point. If you have a flat region in the middle and then it steepens again. Is that something you considered as a possibility in the fitting in the earlier work?
No, and it would get steeper again out here, so?
Yeah, like you have a flat region around zero.
I haven't looked for that because it didn't occur to me. Let me think. What I do know is that some people think there is yet another kink on this side that is even steeper. That you sort of, it is more like what's looks like hyperbola. So that it gets, as you get a big negative gap, you just got a lot of inflation. And again, COVID would sort of support that.
Yeah.
Let me write that down though, because I hadn't thought to check. All right, so how am I doing the time? Let's see, time. Well, I'll try to finish in 15. I don't want, this is not in the paper. I thought to do it afterwards, but I thought, oh, how, you know, in the last 20 some years, do we see Phillips curves in raw data? So I showed identified rate. And this is pretty a strong test because I'm not correcting for any possible demographic or institutional changes in natural rate of unemployment. I'm not correcting for energy or commodity prices. I'm not allowing for any lag dynamics or adjustment or, you know, so I'm really, it's a really difficult thing for this to show up. What you see, this is for weightings on the right and for GDP on the left, and they don't look that different. I don't know, I see three, I mean, for what it's worth, I see three cases. One, you look at the top, let's focus on this panel. The top, France and Spain, pretty strong Phillips curve there. I was actually surprised that those countries had such great Phillips curves. But even there, you might notice that some of it looks like flattening on the right, a little less steepness on the right than on the left. So already a bit of a sense of linearity. Then the second type of countries are like Sweden or the United States, where you've got a big flat or cloudy region, and then only the far left maybe some steepness. Again, a big flat or cloudy region and a bit of steepness. That's again consistent with this nonlinear curve. And then the final group is sort of like declared, puts no easy no relationship at all. But again, maybe it's possible that if we had observations to the left, we could have seen a bit more steepness, but it's just not there in the data. So for what it's worth, this is what raw data looks like, no manipulation by me. Okay. So so if we take that this price adjustment process is nonlinear, then what does it matter? What does it do? I don't want to go into, I'm not a theorist again, but a new paper by Peterson, Steinson, and a theoretical DSGE model, which has nonlinear price adjustment process, like the format they say. They have some strong conclusions. They say, well, look, raising inflation target from 2 to 4 would reduce average unemployment by 2 percentage points. It's a calibrated model. I think that's a bit extreme, but I was just told yesterday at the ECB, there's a researcher there who has a different model and gets almost identical results. So I'm a little, you know, it's perhaps credible. The earlier paper, Acrologic is Perry, back in 1996, had mentioned the same point, but they didn't think it would matter until inflation got below 2. But they had no evidence to support that. That was just their feeling. And frankly, our paper I'm presenting today doesn't have a lot of evidence to support this. I believe it may be true, but it seems a bit extreme. I mean, it seems like a bit maybe exaggerated, but I think the argument is right. What is going on? I'm trying to, if I can make this intuitive. It has to, well, maybe for the statisticians among you, this makes sense, and the rest of you can ignore it, but when you have an economy that has random shocks and is moving around because of random exogenous impulses in the data, so there's always something going on that's outside your model, and it shocks, it jumps around. If the model is linear, then that randomness doesn't change the average value of variance. So the average level of unemployment is the same whether there's no randomness or there is randomness, because it's going to be averaging around the natural rate, the U star rate. But if the model is non-linear, then as you go from no shocks and stable model to shocks and business cycles and noise in the data, the average doesn't have to equal that steady state value. And this is what they're working on. That's what causes this result. The nonlinearity is such that it makes the economy deviate from average. So how does raising the inflation target help? Well, raising the inflation target makes the Phillips curve more linear. And when it becomes more linear, then randomness doesn't cause the average level of unemployment to rise, because you get low and high equal, as opposed to when it's non-linear, you get mostly high unemployment. And so that's why that result holds. However, there's another way to get the same outcome, which is even if you keep the inflation target low, you could increase the aggressiveness of central bank stabilization policy, and that's what they talk about too. And I think this, and Volker, I haven't done this in this paper, but it's sort of what they do. If you raise the coefficient in, say, the Taylor rule on unemployment or the output gap, you will get a higher average and a lower average level of unemployment, because you will minimize these movements around the curve. And that is, I'm going to focus more on that one. But the other point that none of these papers focus on, which I think is important, is that all of us assume that central banks know the true model, they know U star, but actually I think that's not a true assumption. And I think, so the second point of my paper is that central banks overestimated U star. We could have done better. U star was actually falling for the past 25 years for demographic reasons, and we didn't know it, and we could have done that. So again, I sort of give you the bottom line of the paper. Now, a paper at the IMF by IR and both show that when we try to estimate U star, linear models get it wrong if the true model is not, and they get it wrong in this way, that unemployment tends to be above the natural rate most of the time in these models, but the way we calculate it assumes that on average unemployment is at the natural rate, because that's what linear models. And I think this may be of interest to more people here, especially those of you in the financial sector. Fed Chair Jerome Powell gave a speech in 2018 that I thought at the time was interesting and got a lot of attention, and I subsequently think was even more profound than I thought at the time. He worried about, does the Fed really know where U star is? Does the Fed really know where R star is? And he called this the stars of monetary policy. You may remember that speech. And he said in particular, and this is in August 2018, that he did not support tightening Fed policy any further, even though unemployment was 4% and the Fed's estimate of the natural rate U star E, the Fed's estimate, was 4.5. So the Fed thought the natural rate was 4.5, unemployment was 4, and our interest rate was about at R star at that point, and inflation was that target. So a conventional Taylor rule might have said maybe a little tightening might have been called for. He said no, I don't trust the U star. A year later, and this is what no one remembered. I didn't know this until recently. A year later, in 2019, the US unemployment rate fell further to 3.5%, a 50-year low, a whole percentage point below the Fed's estimate that you saw. And the Fed began lowering interest rates. No one remembers this. The Fed cut interest rates 75 basis points from August to November 2019 because core inflation, which was around 2, began to tick down a bit to like 1.7, not much, but just a bit. And the Fed acted on it. I think that was right. I think the Fed overestimated use starting, and I think Powell thought that. And 3 months later, COVID hit, and the Fed basically put the pedal to the floor, went to zero, massive QE, we had massive fiscal, the rest, supply chain issues, everything. The whole world went to hell. So you could argue that maybe they shouldn't have been pushing the economy stronger at that point, but to make that case based on a series of unusual shocks that we haven't seen combined in 100 years strikes me. I don't want to make that. I think he would have been proven right if we had not had the COVID. So I'm going to quickly go through this now. We all know that advanced economies have moved to low inflation in the 90s. That's when it happened in all these countries. And so that's the key, because you need an environment of very low and stable inflation for this non-linearity to appear. It's not important in the 70s and 80s when we have higher inflation. I think estimates of output gaps are biased, but even the ones we have are mostly on the negative side. Now, a small note, I'm sorry to do this to you, but I've been talking about unemployment for so long. I'm now switching temporarily to employment, which is the minus opposite of that, because I'm looking at output gaps, which are also the opposite. So in this case, a high value is a boom and a low value is a recession. Keep that in mind. So I'll switch back on later, but temporarily, we're going to do this so that they're both measured in the same direction: employment, excess employment, excess output. What you see, this is IMF and OECD estimates of where the gaps are. And the boxes are the central tendencies, and then the whiskers tell you a bit about health distribution, not 10%, 9%. With the exchange values. They tend to be below zero, even so, and I think they're biased to be towards zero. So my point is also going to be that in reality, these are even further below, and in reality, these are even further below, because they're biased towards zero, but even so, they're below zero. So it's interesting, even already. I think that's because these estimates are based on longer samples before 1995, and there were some years then that were above potential. We did have years above potential back in the 70s, maybe. So, and this is, so as I say, I think the true gaps are even more negative than what we thought. And what I'm going to show you, I've looked at even, you do see there are some Spain, of course, but also Italy for employment, and then some more countries than you can figure out, but are estimated to have been above potential at some times by significant amounts, 3-4%. So did those episodes have any effect on inflation? I know the curve slope is flat, but was there any evidence of it? Well, no. Here are the biggest employment gaps in the sample, and you see Italy and Spain now estimated to have huge excess booms before the Great Recession. No upward pressure on inflation. This tiny blip here is entirely because of energy prices. If we took that out, it's just went down. No evidence of upward pressure in Spain either. Then once the recession hit, then it gets some downward, but that's also a lot of energy pricing now. So I don't like having PCE inflation because it includes energy pricing, but that's what you get. So I don't see those gaps cause upward pressure. But did the negative gaps cause downward pressure? Some. Again, it's flat, but you can see, Spanish inflation really was very, very low for many years after the recession. Big negative gaps, and even the U.S. had some downward pressure, not a lot, but again, a bit below target. So you can see a bit of it, consistent with the very gentle slope on that side of the filter. I added this is not in the paper. These gaps get changed over time. Both the IMF and the OECD change them by a lot. So in Spain and Italy here, if you look at these gaps in 2007, what they thought they were 0. And that's consistent with no inflationary pressure. What they then did was, well, because they went into such deep recessions afterwards, they must have been above potential before, because by the very nature of their gaps, they can't always be on one side for 20 years in a row. That's the assumption they make. Well, I think that's the wrong assumption. They were on the same side 20 years in a row. Well, Canada and France are now estimated, they weren't 2 years ago, but they are now estimated to have big gaps that before the Great Recession. But again, you don't see any, and here they have core coefficients, which is better. But you don't see inflationary pressure. So I think these gaps are overstated. I think we were below potential. Well, and as I say, the gaps revised to be around 0. I'm not going to get into that. So just to show you, I'm going to go back now to unemployment. So pardon the switch, but we're going back to the world of unemployment. Is U star. So now high value is down, we've got high value is below. Red dash lines are unemployment rates in these countries over time. And the blue solid line is what the OECD estimates the natural rate to be. And it just sort of moves through the middle of these things pretty much. Kind of smooths through. I think Germany is a puzzle to me, and I would welcome maybe after the I need to finish. In 5 minutes, that would be good. I'm almost done. I welcome any comments. I think the Hartz reforms, everyone seems to think they matter, but they don't show up in OECD data. But maybe that's why there's that big drop in Germany. I'd like to hear more about that. But the key point is that there are both up and down movements. They kind of smooth through what actually happened. That's just the process that they use. But the most commonly cited fundamentals were all moving towards lower U stars. In particular, the ratio of young people in the labor force has been declining, and that has been shown to be a good thing for employment. And actually, as you get older, workers are more likely to be employed and find jobs. It's the young people who have trouble. So that should lower than the natural rate. Education should lower the natural rate, and declining employment protection should lower the natural rate. And Hartz reforms just don't show up in the German data here, so I don't quite understand why. But this, if you want a single case study, let's see. I gotta go fast. Yeah. We all know that Japan was in a massive boom in the 80s. This is 1990, and the bubble burst right around here, and so they probably were below potential. Net unemployment was probably too low briefly, but then it quickly rose, and the OECD just started to raise its natural rate with it. And in 2005, it attributed it to temporary workers and outsourcing to Asia. Well, and then this is roughly when Abe was elected and Kuroda installed right here. Started falling before that, but it really continued. And the OECD marks down. Well, in 2019, the OECD had no explanation for this. It just did it in Revelation. It actually noted that the reasons they had argued for the rise had only continued to operate. And so that was like basically admitting that they probably were wrong. I don't know. There's no reason to think that natural rate of unemployment in Japan was ever above 2.5, and probably just gently drifted down to 2.5. So this, I think, is striking. Now, I'm not going to go into these. I did some regressions and some simulations just showing how this model can explain what we see in the data, but I don't have time to so I won't do that now. We know central banks have been marking down our star, so this is just to say that, you know, if you believe that our star's fallen, I know that may not be universally agreed, but if you believe it, central banks have been behind the curve. They might have been tighter than they expected. That might be another reason why we were having excess employment. Hit the zero bound. Again, not that central by paper, but another reason that we might have been not easing as much as we wanted. Bottom line of the paper, I only have one response. So this is this one in the bottom. The bottom line is this, and then one response. So the bottom line of my paper is a very rough, and I need to improvement. Again, I welcome suggestions on how to improve this. How could I improve the OECD estimates? And by the way, I don't mean to, I said the OECD a lot. There's nothing unique about the OECD. It's the same for the IMF. It's the same for the EU Commission. It's the same for most central banks. They all do the same things, same way. They're not that different. I think they're all wrong. Their OECD estimate of the unemployment gap. Now, this is actual unemployment minus the estimate of the natural rate, so it's the gap. Fluctuates around zero because that's basically, it's constructed by definition, that's how it's constructed. Fluctuates around zero. I think the true gap has been high. We had excess unemployment. So how do I construct this? So what I make two assumptions. I don't believe that the natural rate of unemployment was ever rising in any of these countries. It was only flat or falling slightly for demographic reasons. So if you assume that, make that assumption. And you assume that the best they did since 1993 was to be at potential. That was the best they did. And so take the best year they had for unemployment, say that's the natural rate, say the natural rate is constant at that level. What do the gaps look like? The red lines tell you, like, I think the true gaps look like. And they're always above the OECD gaps. That's sort of by construction, but it's just meant to give you a sense of how much. And it's possible that I'm understating this because it may be they were never at potential, ever. And I assume that they were at least once. But this gives you a sense. So you could have had a lot more employment, several percent of the labor force, which means several percent of output, year in and year out, many years, almost continuously, ever since the mid-90s. In a few cases, maybe we were below potential in 1990, yes, below the in 1990, but ever since the mid-90s, we've been up. That's what this is. Okay, final thought. And it's a bit repetitive, but so one implication of the paper, which I didn't provide a lot of support for, but it is implicit in the models and the nonlinear, is that a slightly harder target. I would not recommend 4, but I think I'm perfectly comfortable with 3, and I don't think most people know the difference. Would actually meaningfully help. It would make the Phillips curve less nonlinear, it would make it easier to estimate. And if it's less nonlinear, then as the economy moves around randomly, it's going to not push us into high unemployment as often. It's going to reduce that bias. And so that's the point of some of the theory papers, including the prize. I say you start by decline, but here I mean sort of quote the stochastically start, not the non-stochastically start, for those of you who are percent. But basically, average you would be. Okay. And also, of course, higher, we know higher inflation target reduces the effect to zero low bound, although we can offset that to some extent QE. But even if you keep the target, you could use a range of models, you could use nonlinear models, you could not place too much emphasis on particular estimates of R star and U star. You could experiment, and here's where we're going. They both say the same thing. They questioned the Fed's estimates of U star, and I believe Powell did so wages, and was willing to push to see if we could go lower on employment, get more people employed. It's a good thing without causing inflation, and the COVID inflation is not because of it. I'll stop.
So we have some time for questions. If there are some immediate questions, yeah,
very quick one.
maybe quickly say your name and where you're from.
Dentist from Madison.
Okay.
Chris Keller from Barclays. Very quick, just reaction to one of the last things you said. You said you're okay with 3, you put the 3 to 4, but you let, you wouldn't advocate 4. And then my question is the following. Apparently, you seem to suggest there is something, or there are negative effects if you put the target too high.
Oh, yeah.
And, so why 100 basis points, so it's 100 basis points, between 2 and 3 that make the difference, but from 3 to 4, we start having issues.
Well. It's just a gut feeling. I'm a central banker at heart. I used to work at the Federal Reserve. I understand the cost of inflation, and I've seen how much Americans and I'm sure Europeans are angry about the inflation we have. But I just think there's a world of difference between 8% inflation, which we have, and 3%. And the one thing that both of you will remember this too. Actually, you are younger than that. Paul Volcker. Volcker, not Volcker. Paul Volcker conquered inflation after that period where expectations got unanchored, and he had to do it through a massive recession. And despite that painful recession, people praised him, and he was remembered very highly, and people, regarded him very highly. He was a hero in America, and I'm sure in other parts of the world too, but in America, rightly so. And what people don't remember is that he only got inflation down to 4. It was only 4. It averaged 4 in after it was, started around 10 or something, and it came down to 4. And everyone was happy. No one was complaining. I mean, there was no political pressure. Greenspan came in after Volcker. And he didn't like 4 because he thought, as an economist, 4 is too low. But there was no political backing to do anything about it. But when we had a recession, then he let it fall, and then he sort of ratified it. Would you say that is fair?
Yeah.
So we got to 2.
That was before they published targets and all that.
Yeah, there was no target. So my memory is just that 4 is the uppermost bound that I would be comfortable with, and I'm a little uncomfortable with it, but people were happy with it.
Yeah, just about that unit that I had 2 questions. The first one is you said when you specify irreversibly control for supply shocks. So how do you actually do that? I think there is a New York Fed indicator now on supply chain disruptions. Do you take that as a dummy variable, or how do you do it?
Well, so the empirical work, the regressions are all before COVID, so that wasn't, the supply chain stuff wasn't an issue. But the key supply controls in some of my earlier, and this is earlier papers, not the paper today, but some earlier papers and work, are things like commodity prices, energy prices, food prices, also, which are set in these global markets that are very flexible and, very different from the labor market. So if you're looking at the effect on inflation, you want to control for that. I think we call that would be supply control. There are also, in the US, there were periods of wage and price controls way back when, you may remember that under Nixon. So you want to put that in.
So how do you do it with the dummy variable? Or do you do
Yeah, so that's a dummy variable, but the price, oil prices are just a variable. There's some other controls. Trying to think. Sometimes you can put exchange rates or import prices in if you think import prices have a direct impact on inflation. That's not for the labor market.
Okay.
Oh, and the other thing is do you think the natural rate is changing all the time for demographic reasons? And so sometimes I control for that with the age of the workforce.
Okay. So your main argument describing the science is to say that central bankers mistake trend unemployment for potential, trend output for potential. And that either want to follow decisions, and thereby they suppress the potential growth rate of the economy as we change. Now, they're doing this experiment to run the economy right with the pandemic. And if you're right in your view, then inflation should return, to relatively low level once all those supply chain disruptions peter out. But if that's not the case, what I'm trying to say is just been through this very big historical experiment that they tried to run the economy much prior to the pandemic. So, if you're right, the inflation will go back down to levels. But would your views be falsified if inflation does not return to those levels?
Yes and no. So I expect in Europe, inflation will come down faster than in the US. because you didn't have the massive macro stimulus that we had. The IMF says the differences aren't too big, but my gut tells me the US fiscal packages were so enormous, and the checks were mailed out and all that money was showered on the economy in every possible way. It was the biggest thing we've ever had in peacetime in the entire history of the US, and by a long shot, it wasn't even. So that led to a mass increase in saving of households, and state and local governments got massive rainy funds that they're only now spending, and it's only, and there's some continuation with the green energy subsidies. So there's just so much overheating, mostly fiscal in the US, that if inflation continues, I will not view that as a criticism of what I'm saying here. But if it continues in Europe, then I'll be more positive.
I mean, maybe before going to the next question, I would say that in Europe, we just did it differently. I mean, we basically kept almost everyone employed, and paid almost the same wage. So
Right.
we had a big support of agri demand,
But
lots of credit given. But anyway, I don't.
But it was tailored more to the need, right? Because
Something better.
you didn't mail checks out to every single person, and you didn't give every vendor, did every state government in Germany get billions and billions of dollars?
Well,
Did they?
let's not go.
All right,
I mean, because we have to look. Yeah,
What did you do?
we did the kind of debt breaks we have. They were eased, of course. The fiscal rules are
Yeah.
abolished.
I'm sure
So
that as bad as maybe in Germany is worse than.
So let's go to the next question. Maybe let's take the two questions together.
Andreas Stone, Allianz Global Investors. Yeah, page 4. If we could see that possibly.
Slide.
I never got my head around it. In my opinion, it's just 3 data points at the top left that basically determine the non-linearity of the whole situation. Are we not putting too much emphasis on those 3 data points, especially as you have many more?
So if this was the only data set that this worked on, I would agree with you. But it's not, because I've now found this true in the US over much different data and over many more countries. So there is further evidence. Now, you're right, in each of those cases, the number of observations on the far left is relatively small. So yes, but it happens again and again. So it happened in the gold standard in the UK, then it happened in the current period in some other countries, and actually quite a few countries. So the fact that you can see this kind of thing in so many countries, not every country, but many countries, gives me more hope. I don't know how to make a statistical significance on the different data sets, across different data sets, but the fact that it shows up again in other data, is what makes me.
2 more questions, one here and
Ingo Meiner from Allianz Global Investors as well. One question, maybe the timing for a discussion about a higher inflation target is not extremely lucky, phrase it in that way. What are the costs in your eyes? So looking to the credibility of the central banks, what do you think quantifying the cost of an increase of the worth of price stability?
Yes. Yeah. Since I don't work at the Fed, I could say, if I worked at the Fed, I would not be saying what I just said. Because no central banker right now wants to talk about inflation target, because any hint that they would raise it is going to make their job very hard. When they suddenly reduce their credibility, raise inflation expectations, makes their job harder. I get that. I can say it because no one listens to me. If you saw Jay Powell's press conference, the one before last, someone asked him this question: is this under consideration of the Federal Market Committee? And he said no. It is not on the table. It is not being considered. And then he said something that I almost fell out of my chair. He said it's a topic we could explore in the future. And then he went right back to saying, but no, we're not going to do it. Well, wait a minute. They have a policy review process which presumably will start in 2024. That's a year away, maybe two. I'm not sure when it's going to start, but is that what he meant? Is that what he had in his mind? Nobody has reported it. I'm like, well, I was shocked that he even went that far. But what are the costs? Yes, of course, there's some cost to higher inflation, but to me, in my mind, unemployment is a measurable, massive loss of output that people, and it's not just physical goods, it's people's well-being and sense of happiness and productivity in society. Especially, it probably matters more in the US than it does in Europe, but even in Europe, I think it's true that having people more jobs is a good thing. And my gut feeling is that it's a trade-off worth making. Now, there are people who do theory papers and they quantify that and they say, yes, it's worth making. I'm not qualified to judge. There are calibrations and parameters that you have to judge, but you can make the case that it's worth making a trade-off. I believe it's true. That becomes a political choice. If you guys really hate inflation that much, then don't make it. But I don't believe Americans would be upset with 3% inflation if it meant we could have 1% lower.
So we have a last question from Maya, and we try to finish on time because when people might get back to the office.
Thank you, Thomas Meyer, Flussbach von Stolz. Your work shows other research also as the Phillips curve is unstable across fundraising, unstable across time. Now, if I take a rather naive approach of an econometrician, who I was, I would say maybe the model is specified. Let me put it this way. Maybe it suffers from omitted variables. Maybe inflation is not explained just by the unemployment gap or the output gap. Maybe there are other variables that influence inflation. Maybe it could be money supply, something that has been considered as debt, but which De Boer and his team has shown perhaps should be considered because it can strike you at some point. Maybe it should be demographics, as Charles Goodhart and his co-author Bradford have shown, that may have also had an influence on inflation. Maybe it could be supply restrictions, as we have experienced the breakage of supply chains in commodity, as we may experience through sanctions or whatever. So what I'm basically asking, if we focus too much on this bivariate relationship between the output gap and inflation, are we not missing the bigger picture?
Well, there's, I guess, two answers to your question. I have, and many people have put in many other variables. So it's not a simple bivariate regression when people look at Phillips curve. They do. Now, money supply, I have not. But I have put demographics. I do think demographics matter. I have put them in. And I have the paper with Christian Forbes. Well, it's the end here, but anyway. This paper with Christian Forbes and myself, which came out. Christian has done some work, and she has many supply-related variables that you're talking about, and global variables, global influences, and all these things matter. And so I agree. We haven't tried money, but everything else you've said we have tried. And the amazing thing to me is all these other controls often fit well. They're often statistically significant. They improve the fit, but they never change the Phillips curve. They don't. They're not important for that. That seems to be a separate.
Okay, thank you.